focused on coaching and managing accountability remotely. Lepsinger, I'll be your host and presenter for today's session, and I see some familiar names, so it's nice to see some people joining us again. Today we're going to talk about three main areas. We're going to talk a little bit about how coaching and managing accountability is different in a virtual setting. What are the skills and techniques that you can use to effectively coach from a distance, and we'll provide you with two tools to help you manage accountability with remote workers. This is part of our RAMP model. When we took a look at what differentiated the most effective virtual leaders, we found that they were particularly effective and focused on four main areas: relationships, accountability, motivation, and purpose and process. And today's session will focus on accountability and specifically coaching from a distance and managing accountability. So what's different about coaching virtually and what makes it a bit more challenging? One is the need to address issues that are relevant for virtual workers. They deal with different issues such as isolation, work-life balance due to some of the time zone differences. The lack of visual cues makes active listening even more essential than when you're operating in a co-located face-to-face environment. There are fewer opportunities to observe performance, and even more feedback is needed, yet there are fewer opportunities to deliver feedback in a timely manner. Coaching people who don't report directly to you tends to be more common in a virtual world, and some communication channels might actually distort the tone or the understanding of your message. In addition to that, when you are coaching during your remote coaching sessions, it's critical to make it more consultative and a problem-solving discussion in order to maintain the other person's self-esteem. In this virtual world, especially if you're on the phone, but even with video, it's important to pay attention to your tone of voice and the inflection of your voice, because that's one of the primary things people are attending to. If they don't have the visual cues, and sometimes the visual cues can be distorted in a virtual setting, the tone of voice really carries a lot of meaning and a big part of the message. It's also important not to assume when people are co-located they have more context and more detail. When we spoke to our virtual leaders in our study, they really were very clear about the need to not make assumptions about what people know or don't know. People tend to pick things up when they're co-located just from the accident of proximity. So the best virtual leaders make sure they fill in context, provide more detail, might even say things that they might not normally say to provide that kind of detail. It's also helpful to ask specific questions to make up for the lack of visual cues, to really elicit information and engage people, to encourage the other person to respond, to ask for a verbal response. You can't see their head nodding. You need to really make sure that what you said is what they heard, and you heard it the same way. Ask the person to restate what they heard, to check for understanding, which is also a skill that you should use. And that's related to increasing your use of paraphrasing and empathizing to confirm understanding, and empathizing to build relationships. These skills are important when you're co-located, but because we're co-located and we have so many visual cues and we're picking up so much information, we tend to get lazy and we don't use these skills as much. In a virtual world, you don't have the luxury of deciding to use them or not use them. They really become essential tools for communication and for coaching in general. So three key skills for coaching remotely. I've been referring to active listening as a key component, focusing on behavior, and providing a balanced response. About active listening, in particular, we're talking about paraphrasing and empathizing. Paraphrasing, as many of you know, is about summarizing the content in your own words. You're confirming that you were in fact listening. Again, without the visual cues, I don't know if you're attending. You could be multitasking. So paraphrasing is a way to demonstrate that you were listening, and specifically it's a way to avoid misunderstandings because you're checking for that. And without visual cues, the opportunities for misunderstandings are greatly increased. So this becomes more than just a nice skill, it becomes an essential skill. And just a quick example, someone says to you, I'm not sure about how to handle the situation with the client, and because I'm new to the account, I think it would be better if you spoke with her. And an example of a paraphrase would be, so you're concerned that because you're not familiar with the history of this account, you won't handle it properly. Again, demonstration of listening and avoiding a misunderstanding of what they meant. Empathizing. If paraphrasing is restating the content, empathizing is restating the feeling. And this is where you basically demonstrate that you understand and you get the person's situation. You get the context within which they are operating and why they would say what they're saying or behave the way they're behaving. It doesn't mean that you agree with what they're doing. It doesn't mean that you feel the same way yourself. It's the way you connect with people. It's the way you build a relationship and build trust in a virtual world. Empathizing is your primary tool for connecting, building relationships, and building trust in a virtual setting. Here's an example. Someone says, solve one problem, and up pops another. What's the use? And the empathetic response could be, it can be pretty frustrating and even discouraging to encounter problem after problem. You could then follow that with, so then give me a few examples so I know what you're talking about, and move it to problem solving. But this really changes the tone of the interaction. It's more of a connection, and it becomes more personal. And again, in the virtual world, without visual cues, and you might also be working with people that you haven't actually met before or just see very infrequently, empathizing becomes more than a nice to have or something that's nice to do. It becomes essential for building a platform upon which you can then coach effectively. The second skill is focusing on behavior. The idea is to talk about and focus on what people say and do rather than on a broader label about attitude and personality. When you're talking about labels, it's more general, tends to be more evaluative, and it's really more your opinion. The idea is to focus more on the behavior, which is specific and descriptive. It's action-oriented. It's what they say and what they did. It's more observable. If you're asking people to either keep doing something or do something differently, then it becomes essential to name the behavior. If you can't name the behavior, it's much less likely you're going to get the outcome that you're looking for. And here's an example related to the behavior side rather than the label. Rather than saying something like, your lack of commitment caused the whole project to fail, you want to say something that's more behaviorally oriented. Lack of commitment may be exactly what you thought you observed, and it may capture the intent of what you're trying to say, but unfortunately it's not particularly helpful. I don't really know what you observed me do. I don't know what it is that I said or did that indicated to you that I have a lack of commitment. I don't know how to change that, right? Even if it was a positive statement, I don't know what to do to keep going. So it's more effective to say something like, Jack, you agreed to complete the report by Friday. When you didn't meet the deadline, the team was unable to complete the analysis and meet the client's deadline. Now I have a better idea of what you mean. I missed the deadline. That's what you meant by lack of commitment. That's something I can do something about, right? And again, on the positive side, it would also run the same way. A little tool to help you identify whether you are at the behavior level. Whenever you have like the label or the feedback that you want to give, you should ask yourself the question, what did the person do or say that indicated that she had a bad attitude, is doing a good job, is a good team player, whatever that particular category or label or attitude is. And then keep asking yourself that question until it doesn't really make sense to ask it again. So for example, If your answer to the question, what did she do to indicate she was procrastinating, and your answer to that is she didn't hand the report in on time, you have a pretty good idea that asking that question again isn't going to get you anything more specific, and you're really at the behavior level. And that's what you want to give the feedback on, not on the good team player or good communicator, but more on the thing that they did that indicated to you that they were. The third coaching skill is a balanced response. And again, the idea here is to reduce defensiveness and minimize the emotional nature of the interaction. So a balanced response is a technique for providing constructive feedback or providing virtual team members responding to a suggestion without being confrontational and without diminishing self-esteem. When you move right to the concern, it both becomes a hotter discussion and it impacts their confidence and self-esteem. So the benefits of a balanced response are that it allows strengths to be leveraged regardless of what the weakness or concern is. It allows the weaknesses to be overcome without losing sight of the strengths. Your overall message to the person is you are confident, there are things that you do well, and there are a few things that you can do differently and better. It's a more balanced message overall. So when you're using a balanced response, you first state what it is that you like about the idea or the suggestion. You focus on the positives. And this is not just a soft positive. It's not just a nice thing to say to lay the groundwork to get to the concern. So you're not just propping them up so you can get to the concern. What you're trying to do here is use this as an opportunity to recognize and reinforce something that's been done well. You're assuming value and you're looking for the positives. And again, this is the opportunity to send the balanced message. When you move just to the concern, you're basically saying, you're a screw-up or you're a loser. And here you're trying to say there are things that you do well. Once you've done that and they are sincere and genuine positives, you can then move to the concerns where you talk a little bit about the person could do differently and better. It's most effective if you put them into a more actionable form. So rather than saying something, if you're responding to one of their ideas, rather than saying something like, well, we could never do that because it would it'd kill the timeline, we'd never hit our deliverable date, to say something like, how could we do what you're suggesting and still meet our commitments and our time frame? It makes it more actionable, puts it into a more problem-solving discussion, and it engages the other person in the dialogue. In addition, as many of you know, to try not to say but. You want to use and when you're transitioning from the positives to the concerns so you don't erase the concerns overall. Here's an example. This is between a manager and a colleague. The colleague says, rolling out this new reporting format now would be a big mistake. We need another 2 weeks of development before we can say it's more efficient and informative. A balanced response would be, you're right about the additional time. It would mean that we have a format that's reliable. How can we do this without appearing unresponsive? Again, in the normal way of doing it, you'd say, no, we can't do that. It's totally unresponsive. We got to stay on the time frame. This is a bit more balanced. It's engaging. And if the person cannot come up with some reasons, then maybe you stay the course. But if they are able to come up with ways to do it without appearing unresponsive, you might actually have even a better idea there. When you're coaching remotely, be aware that virtual workers face unique challenges like isolation, the use of technology, time zone differences, work-life balance, that may be a bit more unique to them. Establish formal processes. You can't rely on the accident of co-location to be able to monitor individual and team performance. You've got to put in a system and a process to collect that information. You might also consider working more flexible hours so you can be available when team members are also working, as opposed to asking everyone to align with your timing. If you can't be there physically, to find a mentor or a partner at the person's location who can be a resource to them. Making regular impromptu contact with team members is about building the relationship. It's not about surprising them, but it's about just checking in, just like you would do if you were in the same location, where you'd walk into their office, you'd see them at the coffee break. You want to use this to establish a relationship. When you are coaching, face-to-face is best, especially if you've got some difficult messages. If you can't do it face-to-face, video would be really good, and you can use the phone. But if you're using the phone, the assumption is you're really ratcheting up the active listening, the paraphrasing, the empathizing, the use of questions, and the balanced response. And email is a tool, but to be used primarily to summarize conversations. Email should never be used to communicate the feedback. You could do it to give positive feedback, but not for the constructive side. So talking about accountability, managing accountability really is an extension of coaching. And it is and you use the key coaching skills to both ensure people know what's expected and to provide them some feedback. So accountability remotely, and here accountability really is all about people pulling their weight. In a remote setting, is that it's harder to observe and to see when people are actually working. So this becomes a bit more of a challenge. The key here on accountability in a virtual setting, and both what's a little bit different or more challenging, is that autonomy becomes particularly important. It's more about meeting deadlines and achieving quality standards than it is about working a certain amount of time or starting work at 8 o'clock and ending at 6 o'clock. Autonomy and being comfortable with people working towards standards and key deadlines rather than putting in like a 9 to 5 kind of day. It's also important to focus on different metrics. In a virtual world, you might want to focus on outcome measures rather than activity measures. It becomes more challenging to monitor and discuss progress. Team members' contributions are much less visible, and because of that, the phenomenon of social loafing occurs. Social loafing is when people either don't believe that anyone is paying attention to what they do, or they don't believe that anyone can connect their activity to the ultimate outcome. And when that occurs, people tend to both take less accountability and less responsibility for their work overall. And the lack of physical proximity may make it difficult for people to prioritize project as things shift. When you're co-located, you pick up on things much quicker. When you're geographically distributed and with time zone differences, this can become particularly difficult. So there are 4 mistakes people tend to make when they're trying to manage accountability or set people up for success. The first is an idea, but not actually agreeing on specific actions and who's going to take the next step. And because of that, everyone assumes someone else is going to do it, falls through the cracks. The second is that you might agree on the action, but there might not be any specific discussion about the completion date. And again, here we're trying to be kind. We know people are busy, so we'll say something like, as soon as you can. The problem with that is that we want it like Wednesday. So we're just setting ourselves up for another problem. The third is waiting until the completion date to check on results, or not even checking at all. Now here, a lot of this is driven by that fear of being a micromanager, and consultants and academics have really put the fear of that into managers. They're so concerned about checking in or monitoring progress because they're perceived it'll demonstrate a lack of trust or a micromanaging, but in fact it actually becomes more essential. Checking in and monitoring becomes more essential in a virtual world, and the more you empower people. And the fourth is not holding people accountable for missed commitments. When they do drop the ball, we just take it back, or we give it to someone else to do, just to kind of keep it moving because we feel we don't have time to fix the mistake. So the first tool in accountability is to set people up for success with the ATC model. A is for action, T is for timetable, C is for checkpoint. You can think of it as air traffic control, so to bring people in for a safe landing. And with action, it's being clear about expectations. If you have not been clear about what you want people to do and what good looks like, it's hard to expect them to achieve that outcome. Timetable is being specific about when you need something, and the checkpoint is setting periodic milestones when you will come together with that person to check on progress. In a virtual world, on the action side, using action plans and team project management sites to both clarify expectations and clarify who's accountable, gets at that social loafing and makes things more visible, and also creating systems to store documents and communication makes the information available to everyone. On the timetable side, setting specific deadlines and posting action plans on a shared site, once again, each person knows what they're responsible for, but it also gets at the transparency and visibility thing to get at the social loafing, because now everybody knows who's responsible for what. And you can make use of automatic reminders that will notify team members early on to give them a better shot at meeting that deadline. The checkpoints become critical. And here we're saying in a virtual world where you don't have the accident of those spontaneous interactions, you're trying to build in key milestones where you will work with the person to check in. Now you do it mutually and you agree on it together, which minimizes the perception of micromanaging, and it integrates project management with coaching opportunities and opportunities to connect and build the relationship. So it's that deliberate, intentional action to connect with people, and this allows you to do that rather than finding some extra time to interact with people. You integrate it into the project, and it's the opportunity to build trust and build relationships. Once you've set people up for success, things still happen. People still might miss their deadlines or get off track. The second tool are 3 coaching questions that you can use after the fact to help increase someone's willingness and ability to take responsibility and accountability. The first question is looking back at the past. What could you have done to prevent the problem, and what, if anything, did you do that might have contributed to the problem? The second question is looking at the present. What can you do right now to get this thing back on track? And the future-oriented question is, what can you do to prevent this from happening again? These 3 questions are 3 key coaching questions that you can use as part of your interaction during those checkpoints. The importance of the present, what can you do right now, is to increase the likelihood that the person will move to action, and you're trying to facilitate that. The future-oriented is when people say, I couldn't do what I needed to do because someone else did not provide the information that I needed, that sounds like an excuse, but it might actually be true. And what this question is intended to get at is, what are you going to do about that? Going forward, how are you going to ensure that doesn't happen again? Because even if it's, it might be true if it's an excuse, what can you do to make sure we don't run into that over and over, because we're going to be doing this work again and working with those people again. So some key tips for managing accountability: frequently reinforce and update team goals. People don't pick up on it in a spontaneous, informal way. You've got to be deliberate about it. Leverage technology. Use technology to track progress on assignments, shared sites, project management software. Use more meaningful metrics that connect the individual contribution to the team goal so they can clearly see that relationships, and ensure transparency in individual tasks and goals and project status so everybody knows what's happening. Once again, you may have to put a system or process in place because normally that might happen in a more informal, spontaneous way. Periodically collect feedback from stakeholders to assess team performance. It doesn't always have to be your interaction with team members, but you also want to check on the recipients of the team service. Encourage a problem-solving attitude instead of making excuses or blaming others. and that balanced response is one way to do it. Active listening also gets at that. But be careful and aware of your comments and how you respond when something goes wrong, and the language you use in talking about other groups. Use those checkpoints in the ATC model as coachable moments and for course correction and as an opportunity to build trust. Build it into the process. Don't leave these interactions up to, some informal, spontaneous thing. It's not going to happen in a virtual setting. And reinforce positive behavior and address below standard performance in a timely manner. That seems like a no-brainer, but in a geographically distributed world, out of sight, out of mind, it becomes easier to both ignore below standard performance or not get to it, and even to give positive reinforcement may not happen in a timely way. So some general best practices, and then we can open it up for questions if some folks have. It's important to remember that virtual workers face unique challenges and that your coaching and your work with them needs to take that into account. Active listening becomes essential. It's more than a nice to have. When you have the visual cues, we get a little lazy. In the virtual world, these skills become absolutely essential. Use those checkpoints. Build them into your interactions so you align coaching, accountability, and the management of the project into one bundle. Use them as coachable moments and course corrections. Increase the use of video. Our research shows, and not surprisingly, that teams and individuals that use video more frequently tend to be more effective. And for coaching in particular and some of these difficult conversations, it's a real value add. Leverage technology in general to track progress on assignments and ensure transparency of individual tasks, goals, and project status in general. So we have a couple of minutes, if you'd like, for a few questions. I guess you could type those into the chat section if you wish. Anyone? And we'll take those.